Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in campaigning and community organising. We work with non-profit, community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe. Dunn Street develops community engagement and organising strategies to win campaigns both big and small. We train engagement staff, volunteers and organisers in leadership and power building. And we help folks craft their own public narrative that tells a story to unite people and move them to act together. If you want to create change in your community in 2023, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also proudly brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Are you passionate about extending access to justice? Maurice Blackburn has an exciting opportunity for a union partnership manager to join the firm on a 12-month contract based in the Melbourne CBD office. This is a high-profile opportunity where you can bring passion and enthusiasm to a role that will see you drive and promote the Maurice Blackburn ethos to help reach more clients in need. To find out more, go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. And for those field organisers out there listening, or people who have got an organising background, this is the job for you. You should, that's the kind of people that Maurice Blackburn are looking for and the skill sets you've got in your organising capacity. So you should definitely go hit up Maury B's and apply for that role. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, the lists that are up to date, the phone banks that can change minds, the emails that drive donations, and events that will energize the community online and offline, as well as those text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, simply go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast, which drops every Friday, that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And we're going abroad, not that far though, we're just going across the ditch to lovely New Zealand, Aotearoa, to talk to Neale Jones, who is the former Chief of Staff to Jacinda Ardern, former Prime Minister, and he's the Managing Director for Capital NZ, which is one of New Zealand's leading public affairs agencies. At Neale and I will have a bit of a chat about, well, originally it was actually just a conversation about the election year that is happening in New Zealand. The election will be held later in the year. But when we booked this episode, we didn't know that Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister, was going to resign. So we've got a lot to talk about in today's episode. So look out for that. Also, don't forget, if you like the show, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and Spotify when you're done listening to the episode, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Podchaser. And don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher, or your favourite podcast app. And follow us on all of our Dunn Street socials, which is Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube. We're also, just to mention, we're doing these episodes audio visual now, very modern, so you can see our ugly mugs as well as hear us. So if you want to check us out, you can watch us on YouTube, and make sure you hit the subscribe button. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Wednesday morning on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and we are going overseas. This is our first overseas episode, I think, since the start of the year, which is exciting and a lot to talk about. He's the former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, and now a Managing Director at Capital NZ, which is New Zealand's leading public affairs agency. Neale Jones, kia ora, and welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Kia ora, Stephen. Good to be back.
I think when we scheduled this interview in the calendar earlier in the year, as a sort of a preview for the 2023 general elections in New Zealand, did you think that the Labor Party would have a different leader heading into this important campaign?
No, I really didn't. As most people who do political commentary find, normally events make a fool of any predictions you've made. So I did a lot of stuff sort of late last year talking about the contours of the 2023 election campaign, and all of those were about Jacinda Ardern and her as leader leading Labor into it. So, yeah, no, I wouldn't have expected that. I think, there'd been a bit of speculation that, that she might leave, but not speculation that anyone really took seriously, I don't think. And certainly when asked, Jacinda had sort of been quite clear she was seeing it through to the election, which, in hindsight is something you have to say, because the moment you say that you're stepping down, I think you become a lame duck. So probably the answer to that is I am fighting the election until the exact moment you're announcing you're not.
Yeah, and that's a fair reflection. Did it catch folks in the party by surprise, the announcement, when she, I think at the time I was in a meeting doing some trainings with some organisers, and I saw someone texted me, and it threw me, like I was mid sort of stream talking about something, and I looked and I went, what? And my brain's like, what the?
Yeah, look, I mean, it did come as a real shock to people. I think no one really expected it. It was, Jacinda Ardern she's been such an important leader for the Labour Party and the centre left in New Zealand. She's sort of took Labour out of its years of trouble and turmoil and made it sort of a not just a force to be reckoned with, but a government people could be proud of. And so I think the idea of what is Labour without Jacinda Ardern, I don't think people had really thought that through, and so it took a bit to process. I think equally sort of surprising for people was Grant Robertson, who was the Deputy Prime Minister, is still the Finance Minister. He was always seen as the natural successor, and at the same time, he announced he wouldn't be standing for the Prime Ministership. So I think there was sort of a double shock in a way for people.
Yeah, that did surprise me. Double shock's the right term. Okay, I was going to say that did surprise me. Obviously, nothing surprised me more than actually the fact that Jacinda was stepping down, but Grant not recontesting as well. What's the thought process there, do you think, from Grant? Because I really rate him.
Yeah, I mean, Grant said that he'd indicated before when he'd lost the leadership races that he wouldn't do it again. I think, to be honest, I think he's probably just as tired as Jacinda is. I mean, the reason she gave is that she was burnt out, that she just exhausted herself through COVID and the economic response, and I think that's fair. I don't think anyone, one of the things I think people sort of reflected on was at first they were shocked, and then they sort of said, actually, I kind of get it. I kind of get that she's sort of led New Zealand through this period where anyone would be exhausted. And I think Grant Robertson has probably been through the same kind of experience. I think he probably looked at it and thought, I've got the finance job down pat. I'm doing that. Do I have what it takes to step up and be Prime Minister and lead her through an election campaign? And probably just felt it wasn't the time for him. And I guess you got to respect that.
You sort of mentioned before that you consider that it was a surprise, but if you look back and think, maybe there actually were some telltale signs to indicate that this may have been the case. What were some of those? I mean, I know that hindsight's a wonderful thing, but what were some of those telltale signs that perhaps her motivation for the job was less than what was required to be the head of a government?
I mean, she always did a good job of showing herself as being on her game. You never sort of looked at her and went, wow, she's not performing. But I think there are, over the last 6 to 12 months, I think there's been a number of issues that have kind of got on top of the government, and I haven't seen the kind of sharp political management that you might expect. And I think perhaps not sort of tackling some of those issues and really being as focused on the ball politically, I think that might reflect just a bit of exhaustion. I think, COVID really has taken a lot out of the senior leadership of the party, and Jacinda Ardern just absolutely worked her guts out through the COVID pandemic and through the economic response. And I think perhaps that led to maybe a lack of focus on some of the sort of bread and butter politics. And I think that probably in hindsight may be a signal, but that's just me speculating.
I mean, let's dig into that a little bit. You make an interesting point that I don't think that is unique to just New Zealand politics. Any government that was governing through the COVID pandemic, the reflections coming out of it is that they are knackered. The politicians, the staff that support those politicians, the experience is that it was 2 years of just exhausting work to keep on top of it, because it was something that was unpredictable, you couldn't control, and you had to, if you're a government that gave a shit and actually wanted to come out with some responses that helped support the community and deal with, the various variants that continue to develop throughout the lifetime of the pandemic, people came out of that going, I'm just knackered.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, as you say, if you're one of the governments that just said, oh, well, we'll let it rip and see what happens, maybe you had a bit more of a relaxing pandemic. But certainly, I mean, Australia will be similar, but certainly for New Zealand, I can tell you the people in the beehive, our executive building, the ministers, the senior officials, the advisors, they absolutely worked their guts out. They were tracing every single case, every single rumoured case. They were working pretty much 24/7. And I don't think people necessarily recognise it, but Jacinda Ardern actually as Prime Minister took quite a hands-on role with the pandemic. Um, she did listen to the science and she did follow the advice of science, but she wasn't one to just leave it to officials and say, well, you can go run the pandemic response. She actually took a very, very hands-on approach. And I think that was part of why we had such a successful response. But I think it also probably took a toll.
I mean, does that go to her style of leadership, that she felt the need to sort of really get involved? Where does that motivation in terms of her leadership come from?
I think it was a particular crisis that she felt, she had to lead, but also she's a details person. I think people often she was dismissed because when she became Prime Minister, she was a younger woman and she had quite a following on social media and in the media, and people sort of dismissed her as being all comms and no detail, whereas actually anyone who'd worked with her knew that she was a policy wonk. She was someone who was intensely focused on the detail of policy. I remember, going to meetings when I was working there as chief of staff or as political director, and most MPs they've had a look at the papers, but they go and have lots of thoughts. She was the one who would say, well, actually, point 15F, I actually want to query that, and she'd actually done the policy thinking. So she is very much a details person, and so I think she had a sense of responsibility through that crisis, and a sense that there needed to be a real sense of leadership from the Prime Minister down through the public service. And so I think that's probably what led to that. She wasn't happy to just leave it to officials to sort of do whatever they did, which, the original plan from the Ministry of Health was to basically go door to door and see if people were still alive. And we ended up with, I think, quite a bold response, which at the time seemed absurd. It took political leadership. I mean, I remember talking to people in government 2 weeks before our borders shut, saying the borders are not going to close with the world, and it is inconceivable we would ever shut the border with Australia. And if you'd relied on just the sort of advice through the public service, you wouldn't have had those bold calls that we had, which I think in times like that require political leadership.
It not that it was a competition in any way, stretch of the imagination, but still, at some points it felt like it was a bit of a kind of a who can go harder, Victoria or New Zealand, the way that we were. You're right. I never thought that we'd ever be able to. In fact, there was an argument there that in the Constitution you cannot restrict movement between the borders of our own states within the Federation. Yet that happened. You're right. I don't think we could ever conceive a notion of that you could not move between Australia and New Zealand. Yet that happened. It was actually quite remarkable, the leadership that was shown by Jacinda over the course of that pandemic.
Yeah, and I mean, she was able to bring people with her. I mean, that the leadership in the time wasn't just making those calls, but it was actually at a time when people were afraid and when there was great danger. She was able to go in front of the country on a daily basis and really talk people through the reasoning, why she was doing it, why it was important we all played our part, and actually got people to agree and comply with some pretty, in hindsight, some pretty major infringements on civil liberties, but ones that we agreed collectively were necessary for the time. And again, I think, talking to any fair-minded person across the political spectrum, they recognise that in that time of crisis, she was able to make those calls and bring people with her. And, as a result, there are as many as 20,000 people alive today who would otherwise not be alive. And that's quite sobering when you think about it.
Yeah, it's a story that I think a lot of us take for granted, is what could have happened if people didn't show the leadership that Jacinda and her government did show, because we only need to look at the examples of what happened in the United States in the early parts of the pandemic. It's just horrific.
Well, this is the thing, right? Most people in New Zealand, and obviously since Omicron and this end of the elimination strategy, there's been we've had more deaths here, but it's not common to have close family members and friends who have died of COVID in New Zealand. When I talk to people in places like the UK and the US, they all have friends and family who've died of COVID. And in general in New Zealand, we just don't. And one of the things I sort of reflect on sometimes when I hear some of the people in hindsight who say, oh, well, it was all a bit overwrought, this whole COVID thing. The government didn't need to do what it did. We didn't have to wear masks. We didn't have to lock down. And they only see sort of the restrictions and the negative implications of that. And they never think to themselves, well, who are these 20,000 people? Who might that have been? And I think if you knew that it was your father or brother or son or daughter who would have died as a result of those restrictions not being there, you might take a very different view. But I think because these are 20,000 people who are theoretical, it's very easy to take a negative view in hindsight.
Do you think sticking with this hindsight question about her decision to not recontest the election this year, was there any external pressure as well, do you think, that factored into her decision to not go around again? And I'm talking outside of her immediate team within the caucus, media, the community. Was anything else weighed on her mind, do you reckon?
Certainly not within the caucus. I mean, Jacinda Ardern has been an absolutely towering figure in the Labour caucus. Every single person there knows they're there because of her. So she has a level of loyalty I've never seen in the Labour Party in my life. But look, I think you can't avoid commenting on the fact there was a pretty extreme amount of negativity and toxicity towards her from a certain sector of the population. And I think that's broken into two categories. One is kind of your the more extreme end, which is sort of your anti-vaxxer conspiracy theory types
Cookers.
who basically, there was the protests outside Parliament about this time last year, which had people holding nooses on the court and threatening to hang her. There were, several people have been, the police have had to go and see, and I think there's been some have gone through court who have threatened to kill her. She would go to public events, and if they were publicised, there would be conspiracy theorists waiting outside threatening to kill her. I mean, it was pretty nasty, horrendous stuff. So there were real security risks. I mean, she ended up leaving beforehand, but the Waitangi Day this year, our national day, normally up at Waitangi where the treaty was signed, she'd made a bit of a tradition of, Jacinda and her senior ministers would cook a barbecue for just members of the public, and they'd come and be served sausages. And it was just a really, great thing about New Zealand's democracy, that accessibility and sort of casual nature of our democracy. And the security services had said to her, sorry, you're going to have to cancel that. We can't guarantee your safety. And so, I think that would have, I don't think that would have caused her to resign, but it can't have helped, I don't think. The other is there is a certain segment of the population who I think became quite online. I don't want to pigeonhole, but generally of the boomer generation, generally male, and they had become quite radicalized, that she was, it was quite misogynistic at time, the abuse. Some of it was that she was giving too much to Māori, that it was some kind of racialized thing, that she was, undermining our democracy by helping Māori too much. But there was sort of a level of, I think, vitriol on the right that I think became quite unpleasant, and that I think those two factors probably didn't help things. As I say, she's been quite clear that wasn't a reason for her resignation, and certainly she's never been one to wallow in sort of self-pity or anything. She's always just said, well, that's the job and I get on with it. But I do think it's caused a lot of reflection in New Zealand, particularly from women, about, if this is what happens when you have a woman prime minister, and that's how they get treated, what does that say for our democracy and for other women stepping up to positions in public life? It really does start to make you think about what impact this kind of behaviour has on our democracy.
When I did hear when she made the announcement, I immediately went back to the time when the Finnish Prime Minister had visited New Zealand, and they were both doing a stand-up, and Jacinda got that dickhead question that was just this broad brush kind of. I can't even remember what the question was,
Something along the lines is are you visiting because you're both kind of young women?
Yeah, just like the laziest of lazy generalizations. And I couldn't help but think back to that and just sort of see the way that both of them handle the question, trying to be polite, but but deep down saying, "You are such a dickhead." Can you, why do I need to answer that question, you moron? And I can't help but think back to that moment, going, I've had enough of this. This is just who are these imbeciles that I'm operating with on a daily basis? And I'm talking about the New Zealand media, and I tend to find your media less snarky and vitriolic as compared to what we have in Australia. Like, your media are more like, for Australian audiences listening, to compare the pair. Your media appear more like a sort of a football writers from the Guardian type of media, less kind of like, I'm going to try and tear your house down kind of media like we have in Australia.
And when we don't have Murdoch and Sky News and all that kind of stuff. But look, I think my reflection on it was, I remember when Helen Clark, former Labour Prime Minister, I remember when she was PM, she faced a lot of kind of misogyny and, people would accuse her of being a secret lesbian and all this, just ridiculous sort of rumours. And I'd hoped when Jacinda came on the scene that we'd move past that. Early on there was a protest against her by some farmers in the election campaign in 2017, and someone held up a sign saying she's a pretty communist. And there were things like that, and I thought, but they were kind of derided, and I thought, well, there'll be a few exceptions, but we've grown as a society, and maybe we're past that. But if anything, it's possibly worse what Jacinda Ardern received than what Helen Clark received. It was, I think, social media and the rise of clickbait. I think we've had a change in the media environment and a group of people becoming utterly brainwormed online that, I was down in Stewart Island, New Zealand last week on holiday, and I was on a fishing charter and talking to the boat captain, seemed like a nice guy. One of the other sort of people on there, British tourist, said, "Oh, what do you think about Jacinda Ardern?" And he just goes, "She's evil. She's an evil woman." And I just thought, really? She's evil? I don't think any reasonable criticism of her would say she's evil. You ask most National Party people I know, they'd say, "Oh no, she's a nice woman, disagree with her policies, blah, blah, blah." But just that level of vitriol, it is a worry.
Sticking with the media, how did they report it? Because here's where I'm coming from with this question. In Australia, when a political leader on the left resigns after what I would call a stellar career, rarely does it happen in politics generally, right? Rarely do politicians have the opportunity to go out on their own terms. Normally it's the electorate that tells them you're done. But those moments when it does happen, certainly here with the Australian media, they don't believe the reason. There's always an underlying factor. There's a cynicism. Like Steve Bracks is a great example. He said, basically, my son, I just, as a father, I've just not been home enough. And one of my sons wrapped his car around a pole a couple of months ago from, I wasn't sure if he was drink driving, but it certainly wasn't a great experience for the family. And he thought, I missed that. I needed to be there as a father. And you know what? I've done enough. I've given a commitment to the public. Now it's time for me to return. But I remember at the time of the meeting, there's something going on. That can't be right. He's done something, right? And then nothing ever came of it. And that was the honest answer. That was the reason why he pulled the pin. How has the media responded to this shocking announcement from Jacinda?
Yeah, I mean, I think the two sort of narratives that came up, one was, well, she's leaving because her popularity is declining and she doesn't want to lose, which, it's true her popularity had been declining. Knowing Jacinda and how she operates, I think that would have made it harder. I think she would have wanted to leave Labour. I think if she was polling really highly, I think she'd have found it much more comfortable leaving. I think leaving at a time when Labour was behind in the polls and her popularity was declining, that probably made it harder for her. So I don't really buy that. The other one was, which mostly, to be fair, reflected concerns from the left, was that argument that she'd been bullied out by misogynists. And I also think that, that is probably places her, I think it's probably unfair. She was very, clear. She was just exhausted. And I think to say that it was a simple case of there was too much misogyny, so she quit, I think kind of diminishes her somewhat, because that's not something that she has ever, been cowed by. But look, I thought by and large the media coverage was pretty fair. Actually, stepping back a bit, I think they were able to get out of some of the really, silly day-to-day partisan nonsense that gets played out, and have a bit more of a broad look at her legacy. There was the usual stuff about, the National Party lines about, oh well, she meant well, but she delivered nothing, which is just not true. But I think, ultimately it was reasonably fair, and I think hopefully as time goes on, there's a more nuanced understanding in New Zealand of her leadership once we sort of step back from, as I say, that partisan silly nonsense.
Let's take a quick break to talk about SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, absolutely. Phone banks that can change minds. Emails that drive donations, and events that will energise the community online and offline. And text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Okay, let's get back to the show. Oh, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions in a moment about her legacy, but I have a question about the timing of her decision. Folks within the party, were they a bit sort of pissed that she waited till the election year itself? I just wondered, I've got my campaign hat on. If I was a campaign director, I'd sort of go, oh, damn it, could you just do it just before Christmas to let the new leader bed in, particularly when the whole country is basically at the beach or watching the cricket, and give them time to sort of set up their shop before you move into election year? I know you can't do these things perfectly and you can't control everything, but I just wondered, was there an attitude amongst the party about that?
Oh, look, I've heard a couple of people say, "Oh, why didn't she go 6 months ago if she was going to go?" kind of thing. Give the new leader some time. But I mean, most people have been pretty understanding, because I think, genuinely, she said, "Look, I thought I'd find the strength through the summer to carry on. I'd regain my, I'd get over my exhaustion and we'd push on." But she said, over the summer she'd reflected and she just didn't have anything left in the tank. I think people kind of accept that. Like, she probably, with all the best will in the world, thought, I'll take a break. And it just didn't work for her. And I think had we had, hindsight 2020, she might have left last year. But the reality is, Chris Hipkins as Prime Minister has had a few weeks, a couple of weeks in the job. He's started well, doesn't seem to have disadvantaged him. Most of the team is staying on, so it's not like he's had to bring in a whole new team or anything. And, I think the public are becoming more open to leadership changes late in the piece than they used to be. I mean, I remember Jacinda Ardern became leader of the Labour Party 7 weeks out from the 2017 election. So, compared to that, 9 months seems like an absolute eternity. So I think people are less of the view they need to get to know someone over sort of a 2-year period, and more open to just saying, look, we'll give you a go.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it makes sense. And having come out of the holiday break, I had that vibe. Certainly when I watched her press conference, it was like, I did really think about this over the Christmas break, and I just nah.
The other thing about Chris Hipkins as well is that he's, he is very experienced, and the public do know him. So he hasn't started from nothing. He hasn't had to build a profile from zero. He was the person, he was the lead minister who took New Zealand through the COVID response. He was on our TVs regularly. And there's a high level of trust there. So I think he already starts with a bit of profile, which perhaps if another leader had been chosen who didn't have the profile, it would have been a lot harder.
We'll talk about Chris in a moment. I just want to get your reflections, because you just mentioned before about the national lines about Jacinda's tenure as Prime Minister was, lovely person, but didn't do anything. What is actually the legacy of the Ardern government that the Labour Party can look back on fondly in years to come?
I think there's a couple of themes. One of them is her management her leadership of New Zealand through a time of crisis not seen by any New Zealand Prime Minister since perhaps the Second World War and the Great Depression. And that was obviously March 15. There was the terrorist attack. A lone gunman shot down, around 50 Muslims at prayer in Christchurch. It was a horrendous tragedy that I think, to this day, I cannot wrap my head around how that happens. And it shocked New Zealanders to the core. It was something that really we couldn't comprehend. And I think what Jacinda managed to do there was with her immediately coming out and saying, "They are us," and she brought the Muslim community into New Zealand's sense of identity, made New Zealanders sort of come around the Muslim community and really show that love, that araha. And Muslims had always been seen in New Zealand as sort of this this group of migrants who had come here recently and weren't really part of society. And she was able to say, no, we're all part of that same community. And I think that love was a great piece of nation building. I have Muslim friends who will forever be thankful to Jacinda Ardern for the way that she responded to that crisis. And I think importantly, did the opposite of what the terrorists intended, which was to try to highlight differences, drive a wedge, and inflict hatred. And actually, Jacinda was able to turn that into a moment of national mourning and solidarity and nation building. So I think that is possibly possibly her finest moment. There were a series of natural disasters, including the Whakaari White Island eruption, which she led New Zealand through, but also the COVID response, as I've mentioned, which did save thousands of lives. And actually, despite all the naysaying of the right, and to this day they'll claim that she destroyed the economy, New Zealand's economy came out of that stronger than most other countries and has had the lowest unemployment, some of the lowest unemployment in the world, some of the strongest economic growth. So I think her leadership through crisis will be what defines her. But I think when you go to her policy legacy, the line is that she hasn't achieved anything, that there's been no delivery. And I think that is unfair for a couple of reasons. One of them is that I think obviously COVID did disrupt her policy agenda. When Jacinda Ardern became Prime Minister and ran for the Labour leadership, she did not do so to manage a crisis. She did so in order to enact a policy agenda. And then COVID came along. And so obviously that has disrupted things. But I think also as someone who is such a great communicator, Jacinda Ardern often didn't communicate her successes very well. And to this day, if you ask people, they'll say, oh, the government's failed on housing and they failed on child poverty. Those are two of the things they were supposed to make progress on. Actually, I had a look at the stats. And if you look at housing, for example, 1 in every 11 houses in New Zealand was built under this government. We are undergoing the biggest housing boom in New Zealand history. State housing, there have been thousands of state houses built. It is one of the biggest expansions of state housing in decades. So there is progress being made there. On child poverty, 65,000 children out of poverty. The Child Poverty Reduction Act, which Jacinda Ardern brought in, requires reporting on all measures, and all of those measures, despite the pandemic, we'd expect things to go backwards. All of those measures are heading in the right direction. So I think actually there is a policy legacy to be proud of, and I think Labour probably needs to do a better job of telling that story.
A couple of things to unpack there. The first one, obviously, at the top of your remarks, was related to the terrorist attack in Christchurch. There's a course at the Kennedy School that Marshall Gantz gives on public narrative, and one of the examples of a story of us, and one of the modules we talk about is called the empathetic bridge in leadership. How a leader can use this empathetic bridge to bring people with you and embody solidarity and a moment of us. And the example that he uses is the speech that Jacinda Ardern gives to, I think it's the memorial. It's outside. I remember seeing the footage of it, and the students are asked to unpack it. And it, and not to sort of, I don't mean to sort of make an academic point about the speech. I actually mean to make a point about its ability to move a community, that effective communication from a political leader. And a lot of the times we talk about leadership in politics and all of its failings, but here is a moment in which we see someone unite a community. Just to bolster your remarks, I mean, it is now taught as an academic piece of communication, and for all the right reasons, right? And I think globally, surely, certainly as an Australian, and I'm even beyond our shores, it was one of the moments where people around the world sat up and went, geez, who is this Who is this Jacinda Ardern in this island off the coast of Australia? This is a remarkable bit of political leadership.
Yeah, and if I could just share a little story, my friend Nuruddin, he's now a Labor councillor in Wellington, and when I asked him, why are you standing? He said, I'd never really felt like I belonged and was part of the community until after March 15, and there was so much grief and mourning. And then I saw Jacinda Ardern's leadership, and I saw the response from New Zealanders, and I felt that I was part of the community, and I felt I was able to step up and actually contribute and represent. And he was elected. He was elected. And I just think of that, and I think he would never have entered politics. He would never have felt comfortable standing up, knocking on doors, standing for election as a representative, had it not been for that moment of nation building.
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic. I just, the other thing I wanted to, as you were saying that, I'm thinking to myself, to the point you said before, that if there was a criticism of the Ardern government, is its inability to communicate some of the wins that it's done in a policy setting. Is that not a bit of a paradox of her leadership? She is an incredibly good communicator. Like, that is a strength she has. Yet there's a criticism against the government broadly that they've not been able to communicate some of the great. I mean, you just listed off some of the policy achievements they've done, whilst operating under conditions of uncertainty because of a bloody global pandemic, and then the implications of that because of what's happened to the economy. Is that a paradox? What's happened there? Why is it she herself is a great communicator, yet the government hasn't been able to communicate some of the things it's done for the community?
I don't have a simple answer there. I'm not sure I know myself, but look, Jacinda Ardern's never been one for the sort of cut and thrust of politics. She's never been one of those people who's like a political animal in that sense, who really wants to have the argument and take it on. She has a very different style of leadership, and I think that was a style of leadership that served us very well. Served us better than someone who is a political operative might have. But in opposition, she wasn't someone who was known as being someone who would score big hits on the government and run up issues, attacking them. That wasn't really her style. But regardless of that, even when she was a relatively junior MP, when I worked in Parliament, people would say, "Oh, you work for Labor. Do you know Jacinda Ardern?" Was always what they asked me, because there was a charisma and an authenticity that people recognised. So I just wonder if perhaps that's why that she's not someone who relishes the political fight. She's based on principle, and she likes to lead, and she likes to sort of see the better nature of people.
Let's turn to the future, and in particular, the new leadership that your country is now under, and also the Labor Party. Chris Hipkins, elected unopposed. Was his ascension to the leadership reasonably smooth? It certainly appeared to be the case from outside, but is there any gossip you want to give us any insight about how Chris ascended to the leadership? Because these things aren't always as straightforward as they may appear.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think my emotional reaction when I saw Jacinda had resigned was, first of all, shock, and then I thought, oh well, I guess we're all getting in behind Grant, and he'll run and we'll be okay. And then when about 30 seconds later I saw that Grant wasn't running, there was sort of this question about, well, what's left? Is this Ardernism without Ardern? What does that mean? Chris Hipkins seemed the obvious contender. There were a few other names in the race. Michael Wood's name came up. He's the workplace relations and minister, and also the transport minister. He's led the fair pay agreements legislation, which is a major industrial relations reform that'll restore some collective bargaining at an industry scale. He's sort of a favourite of the unions and a lot of support in the party. Kitty Allen, who's a relatively new young Māori MP from the East Coast region of New Zealand. So that there was a couple of other contenders, but Chris Hipkins seemed early on the obvious choice. He has the most experience in Parliament. He's someone who, has operated at a very senior level, was known by New Zealanders, was trusted through the COVID response, and was seen to be someone who could sort of hit the ground running on day one. And so my fear, I had two fears. One fear was that we would end up with a leadership race while in government, and the start of the political year would be Labour MPs going around every small town in the country doing a rodeo to gain support of party members, which I think would have looked a bit self-indulgent at a time when there's a cost of living crisis and the Prime Minister's resigned, and people would say, come on, guys, what are you doing? They avoided that through having 66% support. Over 66% support is the threshold in caucus to not have to go to that runoff. I was also concerned there might just be media jostling, that you'd see sort of stories about deals being done in horse trading, which again might look a bit self-indulgent. None of that happened. It was a remarkably civil process. They were all up in Napier for their caucus retreat. They basically closed the doors, had a good chat, and all ended up uniting behind Chris Hipkins. It's not to say there weren't, people discussing the other options, but ultimately everyone said, no, we can unite around Chris. He's the obvious person. And it was utterly seamless. Quite a departure from some of the other times I've seen the Labour Party when there's been leadership selections.
I must admit, my observations of the New Zealand Labour Party you've always been a little bit more mature than your cousins across the Tasman when it comes to this sort of stuff.
I don't know, Stephen. I was there during the sort of Shearer Cunliffe era where there was blood on the floor. There were people in the media slamming each other. It's been pretty ugly in New Zealand Labour in the past. And to be fair, the New Zealand National Party's had similarly ugly times. So I have to say, at a time when New Zealanders were in election year, worried about the economy, shocked by the resignation of a Prime Minister, to just see a seamless transition, I think was exactly what Labour needed.
Tick. Tell us a bit about Chris Hipkins. Like, where's he from? What's his background? What's his politics? What do we expect from him as a leader?
So he's the MP for Rimutaka, which is based in the satellite city of Upper Hutt, just north of Wellington. Sort of a working class electorate, working middle class electorate, very kind of middle New Zealand. He's from the Hutt Valley. So he loves it. He's a bit of a daggy dad in his dress sense. He's the sort of guy who'll rock up in cargo shorts and a dirty old hoodie. You kind of go, mate, what are you wearing? I don't know if you saw over the ditch, but we had there was during the Napier caucus retreat, he was door stopped in the street, and he was wearing a dirty dog sunglasses, otherwise known as speed dealers. He had an old black hat on, and he had a dirty old black hoodie, and he just looked like some guy like selling drugs on the corner, and that became a bit of a meme. But he is so on the one hand he is very based in that community. My mum she'll be at the Upper Hutt Mitre 10 hardware store, and she'll bump into him there in his cargo shorts buying DIY supplies. So there is sort of that to him. At the same time, he is a real political operative. He is a political animal. He is someone who knows politics well, plays it hard. He understands parliamentary process and the machinery of government, I think, better than anyone else in the Labour caucus. So he knows how to get things done. And so I think he brings that mix of kind of a someone who is deeply political and a political strategist, with also having those roots in that community and not just being sort of a cosmopolitan urban stereotype like you might expect, or like the right might portray a Labour leader. And so I think there is a sense in Labour that he is someone who can be a foil to Christopher Luxon, the opposition leader. Luxon is a former CEO of Air New Zealand. His policies have been very much sort of tax cuts for the wealthy and that sort of thing. And having someone who is more based in a working and middle class community and who is sort of more enmeshed in that community might, I think, be a useful foil against Luxon.
A nice contrast. What are some of you touched on some of the strengths of his leadership, particularly as a political operator. What other strengths are there that would be an asset going into a campaign year?
Well, I think part of the government's problem is that there are a series of policies that had that had got the public offside, and some of these weren't even the substance of the policies. I mean, there's the TVNZ Radio New Zealand merger, which I don't think anyone really cares about. There's the Three Waters water infrastructure reform, which has become bogged down, which again I don't think people are concerned about the detail of. but I think they had become symbols of a government that was focused on their own priorities and not on the public's priority, which is cost of living. And that has been the overwhelming, the number one issue by far is cost of living. And I think the government hadn't really shown New Zealanders that it understood the challenges they were facing, and it hadn't demonstrated that it was able to help assist New Zealanders through that. And it looked like it was just focused on the wrong things. And I think Chris Hipkins is in a position, possibly more than even Grant Robertson would have been, to be able to say, actually, you know what? We're ditching these things you don't like, and we do a bunch of things you do like, and do a bit of a reset for election year. And what the early polls show, I mean, Hipkins is more trusted than the opposition leader, Christopher Luxon. He rates higher in the preferred PM, and Labour's shot up to be leading National again. And what I'm hearing around the place is people saying, you know what? I had kind of gone off Labour and Jacinda, but look, this Chris Hipkins guy, I'm willing to give him a chance. And I think what's happened is the phone had gone off the hook for a lot of voters. I think the phone's back on the hook. Doesn't mean Labour's necessarily won them, but they're listening again.
It's interesting you talk about cost of living. Obviously, that was one of the major issues, or it was the number one issue for the federal election and the number one issue for the most recent Victorian state election. Now, political orthodoxy normally tells us that's a terrible dynamic for a centre-left party to try and win on. Yet, federally, coming from opposition into government, the Albanese campaign managed to turn that into a positive boon and Labor rated stronger in polling on cost of living than the Tories. And the same as example in the Victorian state election. And the Andrews government used, incumbency to drive home a whole bunch of measures, policy announcements that went to the hip pocket of Victorian voters and be able to say to them, look, we're actually fair income about trying to deal with the cost of living. We get it, we understand it. And these are the things we're kind of trying to do, free kinder and a whole bunch of other things that I won't bother going into. What are you seeing from the new Hipkins government in terms of addressing that cost of living issue and making it a positive for Labor?
Well, I mean, the analysis of Labour strategists is that in a cost of living crisis, who are you going to trust to support you and your family? And their view is Labour is traditionally the party that backs working families, and National is the party that backs the wealthiest few. And so the first thing to do is to not shy away from cost of living. And I think Labour over the last 12 months, they've made a few policy initiatives to try and address cost of living, but they've almost seemed a bit embarrassed to talk about it. And I think there's a recognition from Hipkins that actually it is the only issue. There is no getting away from it, and you have to actually lean really heavily into it and recognise that's the issue, and then show you're the one. And so I think what we're going to see, he's yet to make major announcements, but I think we'll see a series of big announcements. I suspect there'll be something around tax or family support in the budget or leading up to the election. National will go big on tax cuts. Those tax cuts, they've already got tax cuts for property speculators and landlords lined up. They've announced a tax policy. They've had to drop their other tax policy of cutting the top tax rate. But their tax package looks like it'll favour those on middle to higher incomes. And I think if Chris Hipkins can put forward a tax package for lower and middle incomes, he'll be in a much better place to support, to show he's the guy to back to support families. And also Labor can be a bit creative. There, like you say, childcare and various other things. There are other costs that Labor can lean into and address and be more interventionist than a National Party might be comfortable doing. So let's see what he has to do. But I think the attitude is right and the strategy is right.
Go big or go home, as I say, and go big early as well, to give folks time to sort of consume that new information before they make their influence.
Well, it also like you don't want to be doing things at the last minute or promising if I'm elected again, because then a credibility issue comes in. Yeah. They say, well, why haven't you done it yet?
What about weaknesses? Not that I want to give it to your opposition about what the weaknesses would be, but if you're running the campaign for National, how are you going to contrast against the new leader?
I think, I mean, the line they're using at the moment is nothing's changed. So it's basically the same Labor government you were kind of a bit tired of. Nothing's changed. It's just, I think the idea is basically it's Jacinda Ardern's Labor Party, but without Jacinda Ardern. I'm not sure how well that's going to work, because I think Chris Hipkins is being so deliberate in differentiating and showing that he's taking a change of approach that I think it's going to be hard for National to say it's the same Labour Party and tar Hipkins with some of the negativity attached to the previous leadership. So I'm not sure there. If I was them, I guess I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't quite know how I'd go it, because Hipkins has done so well. I think if he had been less assured in his start, I think I might say, well, he's just the kind of third string person in the party. He's sort of one of the also-rans, and Jacinda's gone. Now it's time for Christopher Luxon and National, and a natural change in the guard. But I'm just not sure they're going to be able to do that.
Let's talk about the electoral map and the pathway to retaining a Labor government. Obviously, after the last election, which was held during the COVID pandemic, remind me, 2021 or 2020 was the last?
2020 was the last election.
Yeah, 2020. Labor went from a minority government in a coalition with a couple of other parties into a majority government, that was a rare thing for Labor anyway. I don't think you'd have to go back to the Helen Clark days to have been in that situation. Is that right?
Wasn't even a majority then.
Wow. Okay, right.
It was the first ever majority under MMP.
Really? Oh, under MMP, of course, yeah, because Longy was pre that. Is the expectation that that the party or the campaign is going to try and hang on to all of the turf that they've got right now and return as a majority government, or is it a case of, yes, that's what we'll aim for, but if we have to go into minority, then and then what does that electoral map look like? And also explain to Australian Victorians, explain to everyone else outside of Victoria as well, how it works in New Zealand, because it's not just a set of electorates electing to a lower house. You've obviously got this different sort of set up there.
So in New Zealand, you have two votes. You have your electorate vote, which decides your local MP, and you have your party vote, which decides what proportion of Parliament will go to that party. Your party vote's the one that really matters for deciding who gets to run the country. And the Labour government having 50% is really a historical anomaly. No one expected it, and I don't expect we'll see it again for decades. So, you always aim for a majority, but realistically, Labour will be wanting to get somewhere between 40 and 45, and then they'll need the Greens and possibly the Māori Party to get a majority. That's not unusual. National, similarly, will be aiming for 40 to 45%, and they'll need the ACT Party to form a majority.
So then if you're looking at an electoral map in order to work out where do you allocate your campaign resources, the complexity of the New Zealand system is that the entire two main islands, I'm sure the smaller ones, of New Zealand is one electorate. So you've got to campaign everywhere because you need to get the votes on the list, right? Where are you allocating your resources to ensure that you're heading to that 40 to 45 number?
So the difference is we don't have marginal electorates in the same way, and we do, but they don't really matter in terms of the makeup of Parliament. So as you say, we have sort of one big electorate for the party vote, and that means that you're not targeting areas so much as you're targeting individuals. So if you're a political party like Labour in New Zealand, you're actually basically ranking individuals and saying, this is an individual who I think can either be persuaded to vote, who's going to vote, can be persuaded to vote Labour, or we think will vote Labour if we can motivate them to vote, because of course we don't have compulsory voting. So really it's more individualised. You're targeting individuals based on who they are, rather than just going electorate to electorate.
And then eventually those individuals come into clusters of, if there's this one woman in the middle of nowhere, you're probably she's be lower down on your list of, even though she's a high person you want to persuade, but...
Well, you might give her a phone call if you've got her phone number, but you probably aren't going to trudge out there and knock on her door. No. Yeah, so I mean, Labour will need to win sort of broadly what's called middle New Zealand. They'll need to persuade them, and those are people who live in suburbs. They are on lower to middle incomes, and they are the people who will switch their vote and might have gone off Labour but can come back. And they'll also need to, and they'll be in suburbs across towns and cities across New Zealand. Similarly, you'll have your large groups of traditional core Labour vote, sort of working class Māori Pacific vote, who will live in areas like South Auckland or Porirua. And you'll need to get out there and just do a big get out the vote campaign and mobilise them. So those are kind of the contours, but it is much more of a, looking at a national database and ranking people and then reaching out to them than sort of sitting in one little area and knocking on every door.
That woman on her own, her name's Heather, by the way. That was a really bad Kiwi joke there. Neale, laugh with me, would you? Everyone in my mind,
I missed it entirely.
Everyone's called Heather. I just always felt that
my mum's called Heather.
Exactly. It's a beautiful name, but anyway, I digress. What I do love about the complexities and, to use your word, the contours of New Zealand politics and electoral politics is that it makes you, as a campaign strategist, you've got to think on various layers, and to pump the tires of the New Zealand Labor campaign operation. I think some of the best campaigners have come out of your country because of that, because it forces you to consider many complexities as opposed to, all right, we just need to get to 45 seats. Here are the marginal seats. Here's where we allocate our resources. It means that you've got to have a good data operation. It means you've got to have a good field team. It means above and beyond all the other things you normally would do in a traditional campaign. And I just think that's props to you guys in terms of the way that you do operate in campaigns.
Yeah, and I think actually it's a good thing for our democracy as well, because what it means is that you're actually looking at the whole country. And any voter anywhere is someone you need to consider. It's not a case of saying, well, I would care about you, but you're in a safe electorate, so I'm not going to bother. It actually forces a party to reach across the whole country in a way that other systems don't require it.
Absolutely. And I guess the opposite of that is like the United States model, where, there are 52 million people living in California and no one campaigns to them because they're always going to vote Democratic. Like, it's just, it's not a great thing for democracy. Neale Jones, thank you very much for your precious time today. We do appreciate you giving us a bit of an update, albeit a bit of a shock that a great leader of the global social democratic community has pulled the pin. We wish her the best in her future endeavours. And also we wish the new Hipkins Labor government the best of luck going into this critically important election year. I want to get you back on the show as we get closer and closer to the election. We do have a great Kiwi audience that listens to Socially Democratic, and I know that we want to build on that. So hopefully we can have you back later in the year as we get closer to the election. Actually, has the election date been set yet?
Yeah, October 14.
Oh, it has been set.
Yep. Parliament rises on August 31, and there's the formal campaign to October 14.
Lock it in your diary, folks. Neale, thank you very much for your time again.
Great talking. Cheers.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians. They've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means you'll get the best results possible. Find out more on their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on. Socially Democratic was brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. To find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign.